Tonight on Rokat, the government is drowning in serious debt while the citizens of the country continue to work very hard to foot the bill. Ballots are being stolen and voices are being silenced as democracy continues to stand on trial across the country. Floods hit one region as drought devastates another in Kenya, while the world's biggest polluters watch from a distance. And foreign powers continue to pull the strings on decisions made by African countries.
Good evening. Thank you for tuning into Rawcat TV. Welcome to Fault Lines. My name is Jesse Kihumba and I'll be with you for the next 25 or so minutes as we debunk emerging issues in Kenya and the world. Every single nation has its breaking points, the places where the pressure builds quietly beneath the surface until the ground begins to shift. In Kenya today, those fault lines are no longer hidden. They are visible in the queues outside hospitals, in the conversations happening at kitchen tables, in the protests on our streets, and in the silences of our communities that have simply stopped expecting change. Tonight, we bring those fault lines into good focus. Every single story that you will hear tonight has a name, a face, and an address somewhere in this Republic of Kenya. This is Fault Lines, and this is where the conversation begins. You can join us on Instagram, Facebook, and X at fault_lines. We would definitely love to hear from you. On to our first story of the day. Kenya's rising debt burden continues to spark debate among economists, policymakers, and ordinary citizens. Many households say that the effects are already being felt through high taxes, increased cost of living, and shrinking job opportunities. Tonight, we examine the structural forces behind Kenya's debt distress, what it means for the country's long-term economic trajectory, and what a credible path forward might look like. From the corridors of Treasury to the streets of Mathare and Kibera, this is a story about choices. Who makes them, who breaks, and who bears the consequences of whether Kenya's most vulnerable citizens will be protected in this process. We examine the structural forces behind Kenya's debt distress, what it means for the country's long-term economic trajectory, and what a credible path forward might look like. Join us and join the conversation on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and X at fault_lines as we continue to discuss. One of our very own Cairo Mutoga sheds more light on this.
If you've ever stood at a shop counter and noticed that your money buys less than it did last year, you're not imagining it. You're living inside a debt crisis. Across Africa, governments borrowed heavily to build roads, hospitals, and power lines. The intention was development. The consequence for many nations has been a debt burden so large that now more money leaves the country in loan repayments than is spent on the needs of ordinary people. Kenya is one of these countries. The national debt has surpassed 10 trillion shillings. To put that in terms every household can understand, the government owes more money than it can comfortably repay. And the cost of that debt shows up in your daily life. It shows up in higher taxes, in the cost of unga and cooking gas, in the fees your child pays at a public school that still lacks desks, and in the roads that remain unfinished. Globally, this is not Kenya's problem alone. Nations from Zambia to Sri Lanka have already been unable to repay what they owe. When the Western economies raise their interest rates, as they have done repeatedly in recent years, the debt that African governments carry becomes more expensive to service overnight. Decisions made in Washington or Brussels land on dinner tables in Kawangware, Kisumu, and Mombasa. The real question this crisis forces is simple, and it belongs to every citizen. Who decided to borrow this money? What was it spent on? And who is being asked to pay it back? The answer, in most cases, is you.
We also had an opportunity to interact with our correspondent on the ground. Triza, you don't borrow any money, but why does every new government loan make your groceries more expensive and your life harder?
Because when Kenya borrows in dollars, it must repay in dollars. To get those dollars, the government prints more shillings, weakening currency. A weaker shilling means imports, that is fuel, wheat, cooking oil, which costs more, and those costs are passed straight to you at the shop.
If Kenya owes so much money, where did it all go? And why are hospitals still unstaffed and roads still broken?
A large chunk goes to repaying old loans before new ones even reach public services. Much of the rest is lost to corruption and inflated government contracts. By the time money reaches a hospital or road, there is very little left, and what arrives is often mismanaged.
When the government runs out of money to repay loans, why is it that your salary, your subsidy, and your child's school is the first one to get a cut?
Because lenders like the IMF make it a condition of any bailout they require the government to reduce spending fast, and the easiest targets are subsided and public sector's wages, not the politicians' budgets or the loan interest itself. The poor have no lobbying power, so they absorb the cuts fast.
To help us understand this issue further, we are now joined by an economics expert, Cuba Houghton. Cuba, in your opinion, how is debt distress affecting key sectors such as public services, employment, and the private sector?
So first, let's define debt distress, right? And so what debt distress is at the public level or at the government level is this burden that the debt payments imposes on spending, right? So for example, if you have 100 shillings that you need to spend, and up to, or 100 shillings that you want to collect in tax revenue, and up to 70% or 70 of those shillings is actually being spent on debt, then you really only have 30 shillings to spend on critical services, right, in different sectors like health and education. And so in Kenya, what we found is that the proportion of those shillings that need to be spent on debt have actually been going up, right? And for public services, what that means is that the amount that government has to spend of the money it can collect, right, on health, on education, on social protection, on water and sanitation and hygiene, is actually being shrunk, right? So what we refer to in public finance as the fiscal space, basically the wiggle room the government has to deliver public services. And so as debt has gone up, the burden has gone up, and that means the amount of space the government has to spend in these different sectors is actually shrunk. On the side of private sector and employment, one of the impacts of government borrowing heavily domestically or within the country when it issues a treasury bill or a treasury bond is that it's usually getting that money or borrowing that money from banks, right, and other financial institutions, but primarily banks. And when banks have a choice between loaning money to you as a citizen and to government, most of the time they'll choose government because government always pays, right? Theoretically, government always pays. But as well, government also pays a bit higher rates, right, than most of us, right? So it can afford to pay banks higher interest than most of us. But anyway, the impact of that is that the amount of credit or the amount of money that government actually, that is actually available from private sector, from the banks, to lend to the rest of the economy is actually shrunk, right? It's actually smaller. Which means is that if I, as a business, want to borrow to expand, the cost of that borrowing is actually going to be higher because of, government is lending at such high rates. So it's something we call the crowding out of the private sector. And that then would affect employment because if I can't expand, I can't employ more people as well. So those are some of the two major impacts.
Let's now boil it down to a personal level. We have seen an increase in borrowing of finances, especially from microfinances and mobile lending applications. What's your take on debt distress, specifically on a personal level, among the low class and middle class citizens?
Great question. I think there's two sides of it, right? Because debt or borrowing arises from a difference between what you hope to spend and what you have as an income. So at the individual level, if you look at the income side, one of the troubles that Kenya has faced in a lot of middle class, lower class, even argue upper class folks face, is that the rise in their income over time at an individual level has actually not been as fast as it has been previously, right? And this is a factor of many things. Some of them are structural, which have to do with essentially the structure of the economy. Because what Kenya has is a small number of sectors that employ a few number of high-skilled people that are then well paid. So a majority of a lot of sectors, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture, that employ the majority of people, do not actually pay that well, right, compared to these other service sectors like hospitality and finance, among others. And so that raises a challenge because not everyone is earning the same. But at the same time, on the spending side, you find that the cost of things is actually still increasing over time. So inflation increases the cost of unga, the cost of bread, or whatever it is that you might consume as an individual over time. So on the one hand, you have that the cost of living is increasing, but your income is also not increasing as much. And as a result, there's a gap. I think I was reading some statistics that over 40% of Kenyans actually still, depend on borrowing monthly in order to meet their monthly expenses. And so it's a function, the debt distress maybe you'd see among low income and particularly middle income households is as a result of that tension, right? The idea that incomes are not increasing, but the cost of living is still rising. It's not a foreign phenomenon. There are a lot of economies, even developed Western economies, that run on credit, right? So America is a great example where nearly everybody has a credit card. Nearly everybody is in debt. Whether it's for education, whether it's for just paying for sandwiches. I think that's also a different thing that has arisen. So the buy now, pay later type schemes. But it's a bit problematic when it's coming from a place of choice, or when it's not coming from a place of choice, but it's coming from a place of necessity, right? So I can choose to take a loan. I should be able to choose to take a loan in order to survive, but now I'm being forced to take a loan in order to survive. So those are some of the factors that play in.
Thank you so much for that, Cuba. Moving on to our next story. Across Kenya, governance concerns and disputed electoral processes continue to challenge public confidence in democratic institutions. Political analysts argue that allegations of electoral malpractice weaken accountability and breed political instability at entry level of government. Since independence, Kenya has made significant strides in building constitutional democracy, yet recurring allegations of electoral manipulation, vote buying, and institutional capture suggest that those gains remain fragile and unevenly distributed. Join this conversation on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and X at fault_lines as we continue to discuss. Fault Lines personnel Wamboi Wamagata gets the ground moving on this.
Every 5 years, Kenyans are handed a ballot paper and asked to choose who will govern them. That moment, brief, quiet, and often taken for granted, is one of the most powerful acts available to any citizen and is one of the most frequently undermined. Electoral malpractice is not an abstract political term. It is the experience of a voter turned away at a polling station without any explanation. It is results announced before votes are counted. It is a constituency where the tally does not match what the witnesses observed. It is the feeling, shared by millions across Africa and the world, that the outcome was determined before any cast a vote. Kenya has lived this reality. The violence that followed the 2007 election left over 1,000 people dead and displaced hundreds of thousands and more. Neighbors turned on neighbors, communities that had coexisted for generations fractured overnight, not because of ancient hatred, but because political leaders manipulated ethnic identity for power and institutions failed to hold them accountable. Reforms have followed, but across the continent, the patterns persist. In the Sahel, elected governments have been overthrown by soldiers. In East Africa, electoral bodies face mounting accusations of partiality. In West Africa, opposition leaders are jailed before votes are cast. For the common citizen, whether a teacher in Eldoret, a fisherman in Kisumu, or a market trader in Gikomba, poor governance is not a headline. It is the pothole that never gets fixed, the bursary that goes to the wrong family, and the hospital that runs out of medicine. It is the cost of a system that serves the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Democracy can only work when citizens can trust that their voice is actually heard. Wambua Magata, Roca TV.
We are now joined by Matthew Ruto, an IEBC voter registration clerk. Matthew, when elections are stolen or results are manipulated, how does that affect the ordinary Kenyan who just wants roads fixed, water flowing, and schools working?
When
the votes, the election are stolen or the votes are manipulated and the wrong person wins, essentially the funds which would go to these resources, that's the school, the roads, the basic needs, it will be channeled somewhere else, maybe to personal gains, which will stagnate a country. The people will be frustrated, and people will not be able to progress and develop according to even the vision which as a country we had. So I think it really beats logic, and it takes us back a few years.
Kenyans have protested, gone to court, and even died over electoral injustice. From where you sit as an expert, what would it actually take for the pattern to break once and for all?
Once and for all, I think people need to be persecuted for all the injustices that they have put the people in. So this one is also a case of the judiciary. The judiciary should actually step up and ensure cases should be, adjourned or completed in due time, as opposed to how we see cases that run years where there's nobody's ever persecuted. People they use other means, and the case usually stagnates. So I think the most important is putting in leaders who have integrity. Like if you compare with other countries like, say China, where they persecute you, or like in Asian countries. So that's the best solution.
Thank you, Martin.
You want to take one? Good. Take two. Good. Two pick up. You want to take one? Camera. Episode 3, scene 24. Slate. Linda? Yeah. Linda. Wow.
Unaweza toka nje ukisikia kukohoa. Kufia hapo.
Bombastic side eye.
No. Boy. Can I argue with him for that? You know maybe he wants it. Bye.
There are a couple of issues with the draft agreement.
Tumemaliza kuact bana.
Now, climate change continues to strain communities across Kenya, with prolonged droughts and increasingly erratic weather patterns placing enormous pressure on natural resources. Environmental experts warn that climate shocks are contributing to food insecurity, displacement, and intensifying competition over water and grazing land, particularly in arid and semi-arid regions. The 2024 floods that tore through Nairobi and other parts of the country served as a stark reminder that climate shocks are no longer isolated events. They are becoming the new normal, with communities barely recovering from one disaster before the next one arrives. Join the conversation on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, and X at fault_lines as we continue to debunk. Wangoi Wainaina tells us more about this.
Ask anyone who farms in Kenya's Central Highlands or herds cattle in Turkana or lives along the banks of the Nairobi River, and they will tell you the same thing. The rains no longer come when they are supposed to. And when they do come, they sometimes come all at once and they take everything. In April 2024, floods swept through Mathare, one of Nairobi's oldest and most densely populated informal settlements. People lost their lives, their belongings, and their homes in a matter of hours. The Mai Mahiu Highway was washed away. Families in Kitengela and along the Rift Valley were displaced overnight. These were not acts of God in any simple sense. They were the consequences of a planet being pushed beyond its limits and of cities built without the infrastructure to absorb what is coming. In northern Kenya, the crisis looks different but is equally devastating. In Turkana, Marsabit, and Mandera, Pastoralist communities that have lived sustainably on these lands for generations are now competing over shrinking grazing pastures and drying water sources. That competition has turned violent. People are dying over cattle and water in ways that were far less common 2 decades ago. The countries generating the most carbon emissions, the industrialized economies of Europe, North America, and Asia, are the most insulated from its consequences. The burden falls on countries like Kenya, which has contributed a fraction of global emissions, yet is experiencing some of the sharpest climate disruption on Earth. This is not just an environmental story. It is a story about fairness and about who suffers the consequences of decisions they had no part in making. Wangoi Wainaina, Rokat TV.
Joining us now is Jason Oyugi. Jason is a junior manager at Gatsby Africa, specializing on commercial forestry. Jason, when forests like Mao or Aberdare shrink due to drought or illegal logging, how does that directly affect the Kenyan farmer or a pastoralist downstream?
Thank you for that, Jesse. I think an important way to look at this is that forests like the Mao and the Aberdare are what we call water towers. So these are areas that Kenya draws a lot of its water from. I mean, they cover less than 1% of our land, and yet we draw over 75% of our water from these forests. And so when they shrink, as they have in recent years, I mean 40,000 acres of the Mao forest, I believe Mao forest or Aberdares, were burnt, like they got completely lost because of fire. What does this mean? Of course, water stress is going to go up. We're going to suffer from lack of water if these water towers are under pressure. What this means, of course, is that farmers will have less water for irrigation. They'll have less water even just to, keep their livelihoods going. So that's one example, one key example in which the Mao forest and the Aberdare forest experiencing shocks are directly affecting the farmer.
Ordinary Kenyans are already competing over land near forests for farming, charcoal, and grazing. As climate shocks continue to get worse, do you see that tension turning into open conflict, and what would it take to prevent that?
That's a great question, Jesse. And I think it's not a question of if it will turn into open conflict. I think it already has turned into open conflict. I mean, in areas of northern Kenya, pastoralists and ranchers are actively fighting against each other, competing over pasture. I mean, we saw a statistic recently that over 90 people were targeted and killed. These are pastoralists that encroached on ranchers because of climate shock. I mean, they couldn't find pasture to feed their cattle. They had to encroach on ranches. Of course, the ranchers are not happy about this, and they open fire, right? You look at big pieces of land like some of these farms in Naivasha. A lot of these farmers are encroaching on this land, not because it's good, but because their land is under stress. They're not getting the productivity they used to because of climate change. And we all know what happens when people enter Delamere's farm, for example, they get shot. So it's pretty bad, I'd say, and conflict is ongoing, and it will get worse if we don't do something about it.
Thank you, Jason. On to our final story this evening. Kenya and many African nations continue to navigate a growing reliance on foreign aid, external loans, and international partnerships. Policy experts argue that weakened multilateral cooperation and deepening external dependency are limiting Kenya's ability to independently shape its own development agenda. The weakening of multilateral institutions has added another layer of complexity into this picture. Kenya, like many of its neighbors, is being asked to navigate a shifting global order while managing domestic pressures that leave very little room for diplomatic maneuver. Join us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, and X at fault_lines as we discuss. One versatile Zawadi Kahara provides us with more information on it.
When Kenya needs a loan to build a road, it goes abroad. When it needs medicine for a disease outbreak, it often depends on foreign donations. When it wants a seat at the table where global decisions are made, it frequently finds that table has already been set by others. This is the reality of external dependency, and it shapes the lives of ordinary Kenyans in ways that rarely make the front page. The international institutions created after the Second World War, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank were designed to coordinate global responses to shared problems, but they're also designed in a world where African nations had no vote, no voice, and no seat at the table. Decades later, the balance of power within these institutions has shifted far less than the world has. When Kenya borrows from the IMF, conditions come attached. Government spending must be cut, subsidies are removed, public sector wages are frozen. These are decisions made in Washington that are felt in Kibera, in Meru, in Nakuru by people who never negotiated those terms and have no mechanism to contest them. China's infrastructure investment in Kenya, the standard gauge railway, road projects, and port developments, has offered an alternative source of financing, but alternatives built on debt carry their own dependencies, their own conditions, and their own long-term consequences for national sovereignty. African leaders have spoken repeatedly about the need for self-determination and continental unity. The African Continental Free Trade Area represents a genuine attempt to build that future, but the gap between the vision and the daily reality of a Kenyan market trader, farmer, or small business owner remains wide. True independence is not only political, it is economic, and that independence is still being negotiated.
We are now joined by international relations analyst Tracy Viona. Tracy, when big international organizations like the UN or World Bank fail to follow through on their promises to African countries, who really suffers? And is Kenya too dependent on those organizations to survive without them?
Yes, Jesse, when organizations like the UN or World Bank fail to keep their promises, the people who suffer the most are ordinary citizens because projects linked to health, education, food security, and infrastructure often slow down or stop. It also shows how vulnerable African countries can become when they rely too heavily on external funding. Kenya is dependent on these institutions in areas like development aid and loans, but the country can't survive without them if it strengthens its local industries, increases tax efficiency, fights corruption, and invests more in self-reliance and regional trade within Africa.
Kenya continuously keeps borrowing money from the IMF, China, and Western countries. Does that kind of dependency actually help ordinary Kenyans, or does it just keep us trapped in the same loop?
Borrowing from the IMF, China, and Western countries can help Kenya in the short term because it funds roads, energy projects, healthcare, and government programs. However, too much borrowing creates debt pressure, high taxes, and repayment burdens that affect ordinary Kenyans through the high cost of living and reduced public spending. Dependency becomes a trap when loans are used poorly or when the economy does not grow fast enough to repay them. The real solution is productive borrowing, transparency, and building a stronger economy that depends less on foreign debt over time. Thank you, Jesse.
Stop being at home talking about prophet. I don't know, Pastor A. I don't know, Liniambia, fasting, that he will eat, that I'll be healed. No, go to the hospital. This is a real life. This is 21st century. Let us stop things that are not going to help us.
4 stories, 4 fault lines, and one unmistakable thread running through all of them. Whether we're talking about debt, governance, climate, or dependency, what sits at the heart of every crisis is a gap between what Kenyan institutions were built to deliver and what Kenyan citizens are actually receiving. Economists tonight told us that fiscal discipline alone will not be enough. that the choices made in the next few years will define the country's economic trajectory for a generation. Our political analysts reminded us as well that democracy is not a destination. It is a practice, and one that requires constant and deliberate protection. The voices from Kenya's arid and semi-arid regions made it clear that climate change is not a future threat to be planned for, it is a present reality already being lived. And on the question of external dependency, the message was equally direct, that Kenya must begin building the internal capacity and regional solidarity needed to chart its own course. These are not easy conversations, but they are necessary ones. Fourth Line exists to have them, openly, honestly, and with the people most affected at the center of the story. To everyone who joined us tonight and gave us their time, we appreciate you. We will continue to follow these stories. For now, my name is Jesse Kihumba. Stay informed, stay engaged, and I will see you the next time on Fourth Lines. Good night.